Finally, we meet the Tarnished, who would be Lord. Oh my. Why the long face? I fear that you were previously acquainted with this vessel. Well, that is most unfortunate, for he is dead. As for his flesh, he gave it to me. Shabriri, I hope you can make your peace with that.
So today we're going to be honoring a fellow madman by the name of Shabriri, with a video exploring his origins and all the people he led astray. And that's astray with quotation marks because it wasn't really that astray if we actually examine it. But first I want to clear up what I believe to be misconceptions about the character. So for example, a popular theory regarding Shabriri is that he slandered the nomadic merchants of the Great Caravan, which ultimately resulted in their current state of being by the events of the game. And I wasn't really thinking about it too much when I just kind of was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. But then when I finally did start thinking about it, I was like, wait a second, these timelines do not add up. So there's two item descriptions that talk about how the frenzy began. The first talks about how it started with Shabriri, the most reviled man in all history. That description comes, of course, from the Howl of Shabriri incantation, but the other comes from the fingerprint shield, which is described as being part of the tomb of a dead god and possessing an intricately carved fingerprint design. It's said that the readerless fingers created this imprint as a way to relay their message to the world. Now, what was this message? Well, I can't read fingerprint, but the description tells us that these very imprints happen to be the first seeds of the frenzied sickness. Now, Shabriri's howl and other descriptions describe him as the first afflicted, frenzied patient ground zero, the very first madman. So one could assume naturally that he found this fingerprint shield at some point, and that's how he became the first afflicted. I think it's safe to assume that the shield wasn't always buried underneath Landell. I don't have much to back that claim, but it just seems likely. I don't think that they would have always had it right underneath their noses. They probably chucked it down there when they banished all the merchants, but we'll get to that part in due time. So I think Shabriri found the shield and gained frenzy, and after becoming this new enlightened version of himself, he thought, well, how's the best way to spread this newfound enlightenment to everybody else? Turns out Shabriri was in luck. There just so happened to be an entire nation full of trader people and merchants that traveled all across the lands and did business with just about everybody. I'm of course talking about the Great Caravan, or the nomadic merchants. That's right, the Quarians of Elden Ring. So being a rather cunning individual, Shabriri quickly ingratiated himself amongst these merchants and traders. I imagine that Shabriri knew that they were well-traveled and worldly people. They'd probably seen a lot of places and different ways of life, so that naturally made them more open-minded. Well, open-minded enough to hear out Shabriri, whereas the rest of the continent probably would have called the guards and had him arrested for blasphemy, or being a heretic or whatever because of his beliefs. And it's at this point, I believe, he laid the foundation for the belief and worship of the Three Fingers, or the Flame of Frenzy, which, whether it's the truth or not, is detailed to us by Hyetta at the end of her questline, and is likely the very same beliefs that Shabriri taught to the merchants, which is basically that whatever controls the Three Fingers and whatever controls the Two Fingers used to be one thing, like one complete thing, called the One Great, and that everything that exists comes from them. However, at some point, the Greater Will, represented by Two Fingers, broke off and did its own thing, probably becoming the primordial crucible that eventually becomes the Erdtree that we know in the game. Basically, somehow the Greater Will broke off and gained dominance and sort of left the rest of the One Great in the dark, represented by the Three Fingers. And I imagine that after Shabriri told this to some of the merchants, and some of the merchants told this to some of their friends, and that if any of them found it even remotely plausible, then they began to develop signs of the blight or the frenzy. Then these blighted merchants unknowingly carried their disease across the lands between, spreading it to various villages and communities, which was all according to Shabriri's plan. Maybe he even gave them the imprint shield as a holy text of some kind. So at first it seems like Shabriri's plan went off without a hitch. However, he was eventually discovered by the Greater Will and their authorities. Probably Rykard, the lead inquisitor, probably had something to do with this, but I can't really prove that. It would be kind of ironic though, wouldn't it, that Rykard, back when he was still working as a justiciar, captured and gouged out Shabriri's eyes for his blasphemy and slandering of the Golden Order and Greater Will and all that, only for him too to eventually go against the Golden Order and adopt his own form of blasphemy. And I mean, granted, Shabriri wants the whole world to be burned away, and Rykard wants to devour the world, so it's not like their goals align in the end. It's just ironic that Rykard could have been the guy that captured him. I mean, there's no proof for that. It's just a fun little sort of headcanon thing. But we know that Shabriri was eventually found out and captured by the Golden Order. He was accused of slandering something and promptly had his eyes gouged out. But what was this slander in question? Well, I think he was punished for slandering the Greater Will and Golden Order by saying that they broke off from some greater god and were actually responsible for all the bad shit that happens in the world and not all the good shit. It stands to reason that they would have this man captured and tortured the way they did, but I think that's the slander that his various descriptions refer to, at least. That's just me. I don't think he slandered the merchant clan. I think that he sort of enlightened them. Although I guess it's more accurate to say that he used them as a mean to an end because they were promptly sealed underneath the Landell capital in that tomb with the fingerprint shield. This likely happened after Shabriri's punishment, but it was done as a way to stop the plague of madness that followed this great caravan wherever it went, which, if the theory is to be believed, was directly caused by Shabriri. So I guess in the end, he is responsible for them being imprisoned underneath Landell. And there's a good chance that that was his plan all along, because when the merchants were imprisoned down there, likely with the fingerprint shield, they began chanting a prayer of despair. And since there were so many of them down there chanting and singing this hopeless song, their profound grief and sadness summoned the Three Fingers into being, a literal avatar of the Flame of Frenzy, an antithesis to the Two Fingers of the Greater Will. I'd also imagine that it was around this time that the Flame of Frenzy began to reside in Shabriri's empty eye sockets. It's unknown what happened to Shabriri after this point, but it can be assumed that he was either tortured to death or kept in prison until he died, after which he became the disembodied spirit demon that is his namesake, Shabriri, the Jewish demon of sleep. Except in Elden Ring, he was more of a frenzied flame demon spirit kind of thing. Fully capable of possessing people, though it seems there might be like a prerequisite. They have to be tricked into giving up their body willingly for him to inhabit it. Or at least that's what he makes it seem like. He could just be lying. And it can be assumed that he's incapable of possessing tarnished individuals, because if he could, why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he just possess a really strong tarnished, go inherit the Flame of Frenzy, and become Lord of Chaos himself? Perhaps he has no interest in that. Perhaps he only wants to guide people to madness. Maybe that's what he truly loves. Temptation does appear to be his thing, but his goal of bringing the Flame of Frenzy to the Lands Between had been achieved, and there were already patches of land across the Lands Between that had been blighted due to the high number of frenzied inhabitants that resided in them. It's worth mentioning that it's entirely possible that Shabriri didn't get necessarily afflicted with madness, and that he just believed what he interpreted from the fingerprints. In which case it would also mean that the madness he supposedly spread to this merchant clan wasn't the frenzied flame blight that we see in the game. Instead, the madness that they were probably buried for was just the fact that they had knowledge they weren't supposed to have. To me, that sounds a lot more on brand for the Golden Order and the Greater Will. Look how they treat the Omen and Misbegotten. Both of those things are of the Erdtree, albeit in its primeval state, the Crucible, but they were of the Erdtree, and one day the Greater Will just decided it didn't want them a part of it anymore. And once the merchants were down there buried, chanting that hopeless Song of Silence, that was when the Three Fingers and the Frenzied Flame were actually summoned into the Lands Between. Before that, there wasn't any influence of theirs to be found across the Lands Between outside of that fingerprint shield. That was the last trace, and it was said to have come from a tomb of a dead god, so presumably the Greater Will killed the rest of the One Great, and the profound misery and suffering that the merchants went through was enough to summon it back into existence, albeit in a much more malevolent form, which I'm assuming has something to do with them being punished for knowing the truth. To me, that just seems more likely, but I don't want to get any more off track than I already have been. Historically, though, Shabriri doesn't resurface again until the days of the dragon fucka, Vyke, one of the most famous knights of the Round Table Hold, and the favored warrior of the Landell dragon cult. He was also taught how to use the extremely rare and powerful Red Lightning, just because the high priest Lanisax, who was a dragon in human form, liked him so much. And since he was an incredibly skilled Tarnished, he was on track to become the next Elden Lord. Well, that was until he came to the revelation that he would have to sacrifice his Finger Maiden to the Flame of Ruin to do so. Vyke was said to be a noble warrior and hero, and he probably cared very deeply for his Finger Maiden. He likely also didn't see how her burning in the Flame of Ruin helped him at all, so he sought an alternative means to burn the Erd Tree and become Elden Lord, one that would spare his Finger Maiden. And that's where Shabriri comes in. Now, it's entirely possible that Shabriri was the one who told Vyke that he would have to sacrifice his Finger Maiden atop the Flame Peak to achieve his victory. Shabriri was probably inhabiting the body of some unfortunate bastard by this time, or he was still just completely disembodied when he came to Vyke. That's entirely possible too. But I imagine he told Vyke the same thing he tells us when we meet him in the game, to go deep beneath Leyndell and inherit the Flame of Frenzy, singe your own flesh to spare that pain from your Finger Maiden. And without announcement, that's exactly what Vyke did, which stopped the Elden Ring from potentially being repaired by Vyke's potential victory, and it also kept the world in its shattered state. It also doesn't appear to have saved Vyke's maiden. While she didn't burn at Flame Peak, she appears to have died after contact with Vyke at that chapel we find her corpse at, in the Frenzied Flame village where Vyke invades us at. I say she either offed herself after realizing what Vyke had done, or just became afflicted with the Flame of Frenzy and eventually perished. So while this might have kept the Elden Ring from being repaired by Vyke, it also wasn't a complete win for Shabriri. Vyke would never become the Lord of Chaos, instead winding up imprisoned in the mountaintops of giants either by his own doing, or by Shabriri himself after Vyke presumably refused to carry out the Flame of Frenzy ending. Interesting thing here, though, is that the Vyke that's residing in the Evergaol no longer possesses any of his Frenzied Flame moves, hinting at the idea that maybe he no longer possesses the Frenzied Flame. It can be assumed that Shabriri just took it from him when Vyke refused to become Lord of Chaos, but Vyke's hostile phantom will still invade you even if you knock this Evergaol version off. So to me it seems like his phantom is like a personification of all of his regrets and despair, because that's what the Flame of Frenzy feeds on. And when you defeat the phantom, he noticeably only drops the spear. So it could be that after agonizing in this place for a long time over the death of his maiden, he left his spear behind and traveled back to the mountaintops to imprison himself. And when he left his crazy afflicted spear behind, it sort of turned this whole area into a madness zone, and quite possibly created a madness phantom demon version of himself because of his connection with the spear and this place, that would in a way sort of invade anybody who approached the chapel housing the dead maiden, who quite literally was a physical embodiment of all of his failures and regrets. Not much to back that, but that's my headcanon, and it's the only way I can sort of make sense of what's probably just an oversight. In the original unpatched game, the Vyke we find in the Evergaol does still possess all of his Frenzied Flame moves, so perhaps it was changed for a reason, perhaps it wasn't, but there's my theory regarding that. So not much is heard from Shabriri after this until the events of the game when we come across him, but he does work behind the scenes before we meet him proper. And that brings us to Yura. So Yura is quite possibly one of the coolest NPCs in the game, but besides that, he's a Ronin who hails from the bloody land of reeds. A land that has sort of given themselves over to blood, or maybe even the Formless Mother. Maybe she has a lot of influence and power there. So think like the Blood Plague from Bloodborne and the Civil War from Sekiro, mix those two up and we have a pretty good idea of what the land of reeds looks like. But because of all this unfortunate shit, it can be assumed that Yura left his homeland as a Ronin. It's possible he wasn't alone when he left. I think it's likely that he left with Eleonora, and they came to the lands between where they promptly became dragon hunters, I'm assuming. It's worth noting that there's no real proof of Eleonora being from the land of reeds. In fact, I think it's probably more likely that she's a native of the lands between, since she's tarnished, I believe. And Yura refers to her as a knight, so that also seems to tell me that she's from the lands between and not the land of reeds. So Yura must have met her when he first came to the lands between. Maybe she's who got him into dragon hunting. But yeah, as they began to kill more and more dragons, Eleonora began to eat their gravelstone hearts, after learning of the Dragon Communion and its ability to grant its users with great power. Yura doesn't appear to have taken part in the Dragon Communion, but he does seem pretty knowledgeable about it, so that seems to be due to his relationship with Eleonora. Eventually, though, she would become so power-hungry that she would become ensnared by the demigod Mog, who had been uplifted in a way by the formless mother, an outer god of blood. This is probably the same entity that caused their whole home country, the land of reeds, to succumb to a form of blood-soaked madness. Now, does that sound familiar to you? It does to me. Sounds like the formless mother took over in a big way down in the land of reeds. It also seems like the very people of the land of reeds are more susceptible to falling under the influence of the formless mother, because we know just as Eleonora did in a quest for power, so did the famous leader of the Inaba, Okina, a dude who was known to wear a Hanya mask of his own face. He was so badass that when he came to the lands between and encountered Mog, he sliced him up a bunch. And Mog was so impressed, he was like, "Do you want to be one of my demons? I'll make you immortal and one of my blood demons." And I imagine that was adequate enough for Okina. But I am getting a little off subject here. So, since Yura was like in love with Eleonora and she kind of just left him for power, he was understandably heartbroken, and he dedicated his life to hunting down the Bloody Fingers, all servants of Mog, the demigod who had swayed his loved one to the influence of the Formless Mother, the being that destroyed his homeland. As far as revenge stories go and, dedicating your life to destroying a certain group of people, I think Yura's is a pretty good reason, pretty understandable. So from this point, he spends the rest of his life hunting down minions of Mog. Specifically the tarnished ones, since they're the most capable or they're the most dangerous. But his ultimate goal appears to be tracking down Eleonora. It's probably the whole reason he started hunting them in the first place, for information as to where to find her. However, no matter how many of these Bloody Fingers he kills, there appears to be more that take their place. And all of this brutal hunting of his own kind, well, humankind, begins to take a bit of a mental toll on Yura. I mean, think about it, his line of work was now just filled with despair and regret since he hasn't been able to find Eleonora yet, and despair that these lands might end up just as twisted and ruined as his homeland, by the very same forces. Now, despite his brooding demeanor and all of his inward sadness, he's actually a pretty helpful guy, and gives the player pretty sound advice when they meet him. He even helps you take out a dragon and, oh boy, what do you know, a bloody finger. Granted, there's a good chance that he was using us as bait to draw out this bloody finger, but he certainly shows up in the nick of time to help if you're too low level to deal with the guy. But after imparting his wisdom to the player, he goes off to Liurnia to track down the Ravenmont assassin, and this is where his mental state begins to slowly catch up with him. After taking out the dollar store version of the Bloody Crow of Canehurst, Yura starts to feel his mind slowly slipping away, hearing the noises of insects and worms, and appearing distracted. He appears to know what's happening to him, as if you inquire about this. He mentions not having much time left and that he's dying to see Eleonora one last time. He then runs off to Landell, where he's promptly killed by Eleonora, unfortunately. I mean, she has dragon incantations, Mog incantations, that kind of busted weapon of hers. Yura was unfortunately quite outmatched. But it can be assumed that after the dust settled from this whole situation, that this is where Shabriri approached Yura, or rather his corpse, and then possessed it. Now sure, when we see Yura's corpse again, now being possessed by Shabriri, he mentions that Yura gave it willingly. And maybe he did. I think that it's entirely possible that Yura knew his mind was failing, and that regardless of what he did, he would soon succumb to the frenzy. I think Yura made a bargain with Shabriri to let his mind remain intact until he was able to track down Eleonora, so that he could see her one last time before his mind was gone. And Yura offered Shabriri his body as compensation for this service. My main reason for thinking this comes from the fact that Shabriri could just lie. He could have just lied to us and acted like he was still Yura. But he instead chooses to be outwardly very creepy and explain to us that no, he's just possessing our old friend Yura's body, and that don't worry about it, Yura gave him the body willingly, so we shouldn't be tripping about it. Because, well, he sure wasn't. If Shabriri was this turbo deceiver, then why wouldn't he lie or at least try to make things look a little less suspicious than they look? He doesn't present himself as very trustworthy when we meet him, and maybe that's his intention. But if he was this master deceiver, then I feel like he would have been, a little more deceitful. But that doesn't mean we should ignore the possibility that Shabriri did take Yura's body unwillingly, and is only lying about that small little detail as a way to, gain our trust or something. That just sounds a little too goofy for me. Like, I'm sure it could work on somebody, but it's like saying, oh, I'm not a bad demon, I'm a good demon. I'm not one of the bad ones at all. This body I stole, I didn't steal it, he gave it to me. His time was up anyway, it didn't really matter. All that is definitely possible, but I just like the idea that they made a bargain a little bit more. That's just my headcanon. But Shabriri's goal with taking Yura's body and heading up to the mountaintops of giants, it's basically the same as it's always been. He's waiting for a Tarnish to come along so he could sway them into becoming the Lord of Chaos, burning the Earth Tree, burning the lands between, reuniting the greater will with the one great, making all one again, and all that good stuff. Make chaos take the world. I think it was a nice touch having Shabriri be a summonable ally for the Godfrey fight. It really illustrates how down he is for the cause. It's sort of like how Yuria in Dark Souls 3 can help you out in the Soul of Cinder fight if you're going through with the Lord of Hollows ending. But I don't know, I feel like I've gotten way off track, and there is more that I have to say about the madness and the frenzy, and I think I'm going to do that in a separate video, mainly just about the Three Fingers and the Flame of Frenzy, so that one will probably take precedence over the Radagon video and the King Bulbin ones that I'm working on. But that shouldn't knock them too far off track. This second part video is pretty much already done. I just need to, record it. I just didn't want this one to be all over the place. Anyway, that's really all I have to say about that for now. So I really hope you guys found the video informative. I hope it was at least somewhat entertaining. If you liked it, please like it. If you disliked it, please dislike it. And if you really enjoy these videos, please consider subscribing. That really helps the channel out. We recently hit 14K. Now that's pretty fucking cool. I never thought I'd even see a number like that. As always, thank you all for your continued support. You've been really, really, really helpful. And let's have our outro because I am rambling. I was thinking I might do a video on the Land of Reeds as well, but similar to my Eoshade one, there isn't really much to tell that I haven't already said in other videos. Maybe it can be one of my little bite-sized lore entries, we'll see. Also, Yellow Jackets came back out of nowhere. I might do a couple videos on that. I mean, as far as TV shows go, that was one of my favorite of last year. But yeah, as always, you guys have a good one. See ya.
Oh, it burns. My eyes, they're melting. Thank you. I have touched them. The words of the Three Fingers. As your maiden, allow me to divine them. All that there is came from the one great. Then came fractures, and births, and souls. But the greater will made a mistake. Torment, despair, affliction, every sin, every curse, every one born of the mistake. And so, what was borrowed must be returned, melted all away with the yellow chaos flame, until all is one again. Those who gave me grapes howled without words, saying they wished they were never born. Become their lord, take their torment, despair, their affliction, every sin, every curse, and melt it all away. As the Lord of Chaos, no more fractures, no more birth.